You cut your potatoes into wedges. You toss them in oil. You slide the tray into the oven, and you wait. And they come out soft in the middle, pale and soggy on the outside, stuck to the pan like they were glued there. You did everything the recipe said. So why do yours never crisp up the way they should? Here's what I found after months of digging. The problem is not your oven, your oil, or your potatoes. The problem is one single step that almost every cook alive today skips before the wedge ever touches heat. 96 out of 100 people leave it out. Your grandmother did not. And somewhere along the way, that step was quietly dropped from the recipes and nobody told us why. I traced it back to a wartime cooking leaflet and a food chemist who wrote it down in plain English before it disappeared. What I found costs nothing, uses one thing already in your kitchen, and works just as well in a tiny rented flat with one cheap oven as it does in any fancy kitchen. Stay with me, because the piece that ties it all together is the part they buried deepest. Let me take you back to where this started for me. It was a wet Sunday afternoon, and I was standing in my daughter's kitchen watching her make wedges for the grandchildren. She did it exactly the way the glossy recipe card told her. Good potatoes, good oil, a hot oven. 40 minutes later, out came a tray of sad, floppy things that nobody wanted. And I remember the smell more than anything, because it took me straight back 60 years to my own grandmother's kitchen in a small terraced house where the wedges came out crackling and golden every single time. Same potatoes, same oven, more or less. But hers worked, and ours did not. And I could not for the life of me tell you what she did differently. That gap bothered me. It sat in the back of my mind for weeks. Because if the potatoes are the same, and the oven is the same, then something between the cutting and the cooking has gone missing. Something we used to do without thinking. Something that got lost in one single generation. So I started digging, and the first thing I noticed was strange. I pulled out every old cookbook I could find. Real ones, the kind with cloth covers and stained pages, the kind that got handed down. And in the older books, the ones printed before the 1960s, the potato instructions were longer, not shorter, longer. They had a step at the start that the modern recipes simply do not have. The old books told you to do something to the potato before you ever cooked it. The new books skip straight from cut to oven. That was my first clue. The instructions did not get better over time. They got shorter, and somebody decided which step to cut. Now here's what that missing step actually is, because I want you to have something you can use tonight, not just a mystery. Before those wedges ever go near heat, the old cooks soak them. They cut the potatoes and drop the raw wedges into a bowl of cold water and let them sit. 30 minutes at the least. An hour was better. Some left them overnight in the pantry. Why? Because a potato is full of starch, and when you cut it, that starch sits on the outside of every wedge like a sticky film. Put that straight in the oven, and the starch turns to glue. It makes the wedge stick to the pan, it traps moisture inside, and it stops the surface from ever going crisp. Soak the wedge in cold water first, and that loose starch washes right off into the bowl. You can see it. The water turns cloudy and white. That cloud is the reason your wedges never crisped. I tried it that same week. Cut my wedges, soaked them for 1 hour, poured off the milky water, dried them well with a clean tea towel, and only then oiled them and roasted them. And for the first time in years, they crackled. The children ate the lot. My daughter looked at me like I had performed a magic trick, and all I had done was remember something we used to know. But here's where it got strange, because soaking alone did not fully explain it. My grandmother's wedges were crispier than mine still were. There was another layer to this. And when I went looking for that layer, I stopped finding kitchen tips and started finding something that looked a lot more deliberate. Because the more old books I read, the more I realized the soaking step did not just fade away on its own. It was pushed out. And to understand who pushed it, I had to look at what changed in our kitchens in the years right after the Second World War. Think about what happened to food in those years. Before the 1950s, most people cooked from raw ingredients they bought loose and cheap. A sack of potatoes cost almost nothing. You did the work yourself, And the work included steps like soaking, parboiling, and drying, because that work was what made cheap food taste good. Nobody sold you the work was yours. Then something shifted. The frozen food business grew up, and the whole point of a frozen bag of chips or wedges was that all that work had already been done for you in a factory. They soaked, they blanched, they par-fried. They did every single step your grandmother did by hand, and then they froze it and sold it back to you at 10 times the price of a raw potato. And to make that sale, they needed one thing to be true. They needed you to believe that getting a crisp wedge from a raw potato at home was hard, fussy, not worth it. So the long way, the home way, the free way quietly stopped being printed. Recipes got shorter. The soaking step vanished. And a whole generation grew up thinking that if you want a properly crisp wedge, you buy the bag from the freezer aisle. That is the first face of the thing I was chasing. Somebody profited every single time we forgot how to do this ourselves. And once I saw that, I could not unsee it. I started counting the cost. A 5-pound sack of potatoes where I live runs about $2. That same weight in frozen, seasoned factory wedges runs closer to $12. 6 times the money for a potato that has been cut and soaked and dried and coated for you. If a family buys the frozen bag once a week, that is a difference of about $500 a year spent to avoid a step that takes 10 seconds of effort and 1 bowl of water. $500 a year to not soak a potato. That is what the forgetting costs. But money was only half of it, because I kept pulling the thread, and the thread led me somewhere I did not expect. It led me to the oil. Here is the clue that stopped me cold. In my grandmother's day, the fat you roasted potatoes in was almost always an animal fat, beef dripping, lard, goose fat if it was a special day. That was not a health choice, and it was not a fashion. It was simply what was in the house, saved in a jar by the stove from the last roast. And those old fats do something at high heat that changes everything about a wedge. An animal fat like beef dripping stays stable at a high oven temperature. It gets hot, truly hot, without breaking down, and that high, stable heat is exactly what drives the water out of the surface of the wedge and turns it golden and crisp. It also carries a savory flavor that soaks into the potato. My grandmother's wedges tasted of something. Mine tasted of the oil I bought in a big plastic bottle. So I looked at when the switch happened, when we went from the jar of dripping by the stove to the big bottle of pale vegetable oil, and the timing told its own story. Through the middle of the last century, we were slowly talked out of the old fats. We were told the new bottled oils were modern and better, and the jar of dripping by the stove became something to be a little ashamed of. Whether that advice was right or wrong is an argument for another day. What matters for your wedges is simple. The old fat behaved differently in a hot oven than the cheap oil most of us reach for now, and part of the crispness we lost the day we tipped out the dripping jar. You do not have to go all the way back to lard to get it. I did not. But I learned to pick a fat that can take real heat without breaking down and to use enough of it because the old cooks were never shy with the fat on a roasting tray. A dry, mean scrape of oil steams a potato. A proper coating fries it against the metal. That was the second layer. Soak to lose the starch. Then use a fat that can take the heat. And yet, even with the soaking and the right fat, I still was not matching the wedges from my memory. There was one more step hiding, and it turned out to be the oldest one of all, and the one that had been buried the deepest. But before I show you that, I need to speak directly to one particular person watching this. Maybe you're thinking this is all very well for someone with a big kitchen and money for good fat and time to soak potatoes overnight. Maybe you live alone. Maybe you rent, and the oven is old, and the budget is tight, and you are tired, and cooking for one hardly feels worth the effort. I want you to stay right here, because everything I found next was made for exactly your situation, and it is the cheapest part of the whole story. Here is the truth. Every single thing I have described costs less, not more, than the way most people cook now. A bowl of cold water is free. You already pay for the water. Soaking the wedges does not cost you effort either, because you walk away and let it sit while you do something else. You are not standing over it. The potato does the waiting for you, and you do not need a fancy fat. If beef dripping is not in your house or your budget, a small amount of any fat that handles heat will do the job, and you use less of it than you think, because a properly soaked and dried wedge does not drink up oil the way a wet one does. That is another quiet saving. The wet wedge that most people cook soaks up extra fat trying to seal itself. The dry, soaked wedge crisps on a thin coat. For one person, this is even easier. Cut 2 potatoes. Soak them in a cereal bowl while you sit down for half an hour. Dry them on the tea towel you already own. A small handful takes 15 minutes in a hot oven or a toaster oven, and you have a plate of proper crisp wedges for the price of 2 potatoes, which is under 50 cents. Compare that to the frozen bag, or worse, to the wedges from the takeaway that cost you $5 or $6 and arrive soft in a paper bag. You are not missing out by being alone or careful with money. You are actually in the best position of anyone to do this the old way, because the old way was invented by people who had nothing to waste. No special tools, no gadget. A knife, a bowl, water, a towel, a tray, and an oven. Every one of those things is already in the smallest, cheapest kitchen. That is why this method survived the hard years. It was built for the hard years. It does not care how much money you have. It only cares that you know the steps. And the steps were taken from us. Which brings me back to the last one, the deepest one, the one that finally closed the whole case. And that is the feeling I want to hand to you today. But before I show you that last buried step, let me tell you about something I put together for people like you. Everything I have dug up through this research, the lost steps, the wartime methods, the old knowledge that got quietly dropped, I have gathered it into a series of digital books called First Tea, Deep Seniors, and System Complete. They are written for ordinary people in ordinary kitchens, the same way those old leaflets were. Plain and practical and with nothing to sell you except the knowledge itself. You can find the details in the description below, and I think if you have followed this far, you will feel right at home inside those pages. Now, back to that deepest step, the one I found in a place I never expected. I found it in an old wartime cooking leaflet, the kind the government printed and handed out in the 1940s when food was rationed and nothing could be wasted and every potato had to be made to go as far as it possibly could. Those leaflets were written by people who understood food chemistry and had no reason to sell you anything, because there was nothing to sell. Their only job was to help ordinary people get the most out of the least. And tucked inside the potato instructions was a step so simple that when I read it, I actually laughed out loud in my kitchen. Before you roast the wedge, you boil it. Just for a few minutes. Not until it is cooked. Just until the very outside edge softens. You put your soaked, dried wedges into a pot of water, bring it to a gentle boil, and let them go for about 5 minutes, no more. Then you drain them, and let the steam dry off them for a minute. And here's the trick within the trick, the part that made me understand why my grandmother's wedges looked the way they did. Once they are drained, you give the pot a gentle shake. Just a few good shakes with the lid on. That shaking roughs up the outside of every wedge. It breaks the smooth-cut surface into a soft, fluffy, ragged layer. And when that ragged, roughened surface hits the hot fat in the oven, every single one of those tiny rough edges turns into a point of crunch. The smooth wedge crisps on a flat face. The roughened wedge crisps on 100 little ridges. That is the golden, craggy, shattering crust I remembered from childhood. That is the secret. Boil briefly, shake to rough the edges, then roast. And there is real science under it, which is why the old leaflet worked. That brief boil does 2 things at once. It starts to cook the inside so the wedge finishes soft and fluffy in the middle instead of hard and raw, and it draws a layer of starch to the surface and turns it into a soft paste that, once roughed up and roasted, sets into that crackling shell. The old cooks did not need to know the chemistry. They knew the result. Soak, boil briefly, shake, dry, then roast in a good hot fat. 5 steps, every one of them free. Every one of them stripped out of the modern recipe one by one until all we had left was cut, oil, oven, and disappointment. I want you to notice what happened here, because it is the whole story in one line. Nobody banned this knowledge. Nobody made it illegal. They simply stopped repeating it. And a thing that is not repeated for one generation is a thing that is gone. My grandmother never wrote it down because she never imagined anyone would forget. Why would you write down how to breathe? It was that obvious to her. And that is exactly why it vanished so completely. The most basic knowledge is the easiest to lose, because nobody thinks to protect it. So let me put the whole case together for you now, from the top, the way it finally came clear in my kitchen. Step 1. You cut your potatoes into wedges, and you do not rush to the oven. You drop them in a bowl of cold water and you let that loose starch wash off. 30 minutes if you are pressed, an hour if you are patient. The water goes cloudy white. That cloud was your enemy, and now it is in the bowl instead of on your wedge. Step 2. You lift them out, you put them in a pot of water, and you bring it to a gentle boil for about 5 minutes. Not longer. You are not cooking them through. You are just softening the very outside and pulling the good starch to the surface. Step 3. You drain them well, you put the lid back on the pot, and you give it a few firm shakes. You are roughing up every edge on purpose. Those rough edges are where the crunch will live. Step 4. You let the steam dry off them for a minute because a dry wedge crisps and a wet wedge steams. Then you toss them in a proper amount of a fat that can take real heat. Step 5. Into a hot oven, and you leave them alone long enough to color and crackle. Turn them once. Let them go golden. That is it. That is the whole thing that 96 out of 100 people never do. The thing that was standing between you and the wedges you remember. Not one of those steps costs a penny more than the potato itself. Every single one of them was common knowledge in the house you or your parents grew up in. And every single one was quietly dropped. Not because it stopped working, but because there was more money in selling you the finished bag than in reminding you that you could do it yourself for pennies. Let me leave you with one more thing that I keep coming back to because it goes past potatoes. When I finish this, when my own wedges finally matched the ones from that little terraced kitchen 60 years ago, I did not just feel pleased about the food. I felt something closer to relief. Because for a while there I honestly believed I had lost the ability. I thought maybe my grandmother had some gift, some knack in her hands that died with her. And she did not. She just had the steps. The steps that were sitting in an old wartime leaflet the whole time, waiting for someone to go looking. There was nothing magic about her. There was only knowledge, plain and repeatable, that I was able to pick back up the moment I found where it had fallen. And that is the feeling I want to hand to you today. Not a recipe. The knowledge that the thing you thought you lost was never really lost. It was only set down and forgotten, and it can be picked right back up. You did not fail at wedges. You were simply never handed the 4 steps between the cutting and the oven, because the people who profit from your freezer had every reason to let those steps fade. You are the kind of person who wanted to know why, who did not just shrug and buy the bag, who followed the thread all the way down to a wartime leaflet with me. That is not a small thing. That is exactly the sort of stubborn, curious mind that keeps this old knowledge alive for the next family. So here's what I want you to tell me. When you were young, in your mother's or your grandmother's kitchen, do you remember the jar of dripping by the stove, or the pot of potatoes boiling before they ever went in to roast? What did the cook in your house do that the recipes today leave out? Write it down in the comments below, because between all of us we can put the whole method back together, piece by piece, the way it used to be passed across the kitchen table. And tell me where you are watching from, because I would love to know how far this old trick has traveled. If you felt that click of something coming back to you, that memory waking up, then come along with me, because that is exactly what we do here. We dig up the plain, practical knowledge that got quietly buried, and we hand it back to the people it was taken from. Next time I am going all the way into the humble loaf of bread, and the one thing the old bakers did to their flour the night before that made a cheap loaf last a week without going hard and stale. It is even simpler than the wedges, and even more forgotten, and once you see it, you will wonder how we ever let it go. Follow along, and let us keep pulling these threads together, one lost trick at a time. If those crispy wedges made you smile, stay with me one more minute. Inside the Wiser Living Circle, I take you through the buried wartime method, the deeper version that picks up right where this video stopped. And in there, you can ask me your own question, and I answer you myself. This is where practical seniors like you belong. Just point your phone's camera at the code on the screen, and you can cancel anytime.